All right, let's see if I can clip this on here somewhere.
Was the volume good?
Yeah, how does that sound though if I talk without having to dip my chin? Can everybody hear me? Fine? Yeah, okay, great. So thank you so much, Tavi, for the invitation to come here to speak, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. And before I begin, just a little secret about that Tavi in her introduction mentioned that I'm a national best-selling author, which might sound maybe just a little bit impressive, but just a little secret in case you don't know how you can call yourself a national best-selling author. Actually, all it takes to become a national best-selling author is having your book on a nationally syndicated newspaper's top 10 list for 1 week. So yes, that did happen, and now our publisher is very pleased because they could write national bestseller on here. But I just, when I hear that, I think, oh, that sounds very impressive. But that's the truth. So just to begin with that little note of humility. So one of the things I like to do is just before talking to all of you, I'd just like to get a better sense of who's in the room. Earlier today was at North Carolina State University, and earlier today I was at University of North Carolina Chapel Hill, and then yesterday I was at NCSU. And so each of these times I've been speaking to groups, getting a better sense of who's there. So my first point of business is asking who all of you are. So how many of you are students here at Duke? Okay, a lot of you, the majority. And are you, I think Tavi mentioned a lot of you here are in the environmental studies part. So how many environmental studies students? Oh, a few. And then how many public health? That's the groups of students I was talking to today. Any public health? What other disciplines or majors of all the people who raised their hand that didn't raise their hand for the environment? Just shout them out. Women's studies. Psychology. Economics. Public policy. Great. Okay, and so for those of you who didn't raise your hand when you said you were a student, I already asked you were a student, how many of you are faculty or teachers or professors? Okay, one faculty. How many of you are members of the broader community here in Durham then? And of those here from Durham community, are any of you farmers? Any farmers in the house? Do you have any farmers? No. Anybody who works in nonprofits working on food-related issues? Yeah, what's your nonprofit? You're at Seeds. Oh, hello. Nice to meet you. I'll see you Saturday. Yeah, we're doing a public event at Seeds, which should be really fun. So, okay, great. Just gives me a little bit of better sense. Anybody want to shout out a category of person who's here who I didn't ask about that you didn't get to raise your hand? Any brave souls? Okay, well, it gives me slightly a good sense of who's here. And just to tell you just a little bit more about myself, so you sort of have a sense of who's talking to you. As Tavi mentioned, I have been working for the past, about 7 years now on these issues of looking at the questions of the root causes of hunger, and also really particularly interested in finding out about movements globally, but also within the U.S. who are really developing creative solutions to address the root causes of hunger. And when people ask me kind of how I got into this work, I sort of jokingly say that in some ways I kind of got into the family business. Both of my parents are in many ways my inspiration for this work. My mother, her life's work has been an inspiration to me, and actually she and I co-authored this book, Hope's Edge, together. And some of you may know her work. Her name is Frances Moore Lappé, and she wrote a book called Diet for a Small Planet. Some of you may be familiar with. Came out in 1971, so it was a precursor to my birth 2 years later. And it was really, she wrote it when she was 26 years old. She was a graduate school dropout, and she was really wanting to really probe at why there is hunger in the world and ask that question. And what she uncovered, despite what all the experts were saying, was that we don't have hunger in the world because we don't have enough food. What she discovered is that there was actually more than enough food to feed everyone. What she discovered is the real root cause of hunger is not a lack of production of food, it's a lack of democracy. It's the lack of people being able to have control over the fundamental decisions of what food gets grown, who gets to grow it, who gets those resources, who gets access to the resources needed to grow food for all of us, and who has access to the food that is produced. And so that answer to the question of why hunger in a world of plenty, has kind of set her on a life path of exploring the interlocking questions of hunger and democracy. And she kind of roped me into this work when she and I wrote Hope's Edge together. And my kind of entry into this work came kind of in a really interesting parallel to my mother's when I was 26 years old and a graduate student. I didn't drop out. I ended up getting my master's at Columbia, but I was a frustrated graduate student like she was, and ended up writing Hope's Edge as my master's thesis because I felt like I would learn more by being apprenticed by my mother and traveling out into the world. We traveled to Bangladesh, India, Poland, Brazil, Kenya, France, and 2 places in the U.S. And I felt like I would learn more having that experience than spending all of my time in a classroom. So she and I had this incredible experience of writing Hope's Edge together, and for me it was just this incredible opportunity to have that experience of working so closely with my mother and really having that chance to learn from her. And it was really through writing Hope's Edge that I got even more kind of passionate about these issues, and particularly passionate about looking at what is happening to food in this country, in our country, the United States, because what I saw traveling around the world was the incredible global reach and impact of the choices that we here as consumers make in the U.S. about food, as well as the choices that we as U.S. voters make about who we elect and who we don't elect and what policies we fight for or don't fight for, and the impact of what our U.S.-based corporations are doing around the world. So just to give you an example of what I mean, because maybe this sounds kind of abstract to you, in terms of the global reach, global impact, the image that comes to mind whenever I think about this was when we were in India, we were driving up into the foothills of the Himalayas, and we were on this tiny dirt road. We're driving with our translator and some of the other farmers that we were traveling to learn from, and we look over to the right side of the road, and on the right-hand side of the road is a grove of eucalyptus trees. If you've ever seen a grove of eucalyptus trees, you know they've got those long, straight trunks, and there was just this enormous grove. And across dozens and dozens of these eucalyptus trees was painted at eye level the Pepsi logo. And we were traveling into a region in India that had never met Westerners before, and yet here was the Pepsi logo blanketing their trees. And we discovered upon arriving in the village that it was actually easier to find Coke or Pepsi than it was to find potable drinking water. And that image, and if any of you have ever spent time in many countries, again, where there might not be a lot of Westerners and remote rural regions of developing countries, you know, this won't be news to you, this phenomenon of this global reach of our U.S. corporations. So that image came to mind and sticks in my mind when I think about the role of our decisions here in this country about what's happening globally. And of course, we can think about the debates that are currently heating up around the climate crisis, and of course the impact that our choices here in the U.S., our policy choices, our who we elect, those choices are making on global ripples that are affecting the environment, and of course then directly affecting the people's ability to feed themselves and to grow food sustainably and grow enough food to feed themselves. So it was that I sort of begin that way, just to tell you a little bit about how I got into this work and how I came to write Hope's Edge, and then from Hope's Edge, my next book, Grub, that TV mentioned a little bit, it was kind of the daughter or sister or cousin, some relation to Hope's Edge, and it was my attempt to really bring these questions about how we think about food home. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to talk a little bit about, I was thinking about when Tavy was describing who might be here, about what I thought would be most interesting to talk with all of you about. So I want to begin by talking about more about this interconnection between food and the environment, and food production and the environment. But then I want to really get into some of the lessons that I feel like my mother and I have learned through writing Hope's Edge, and that I've learned in the research for Grub, about how we can shift our thinking about food system and food production in order to really root out and get at the root of these questions about how we can feed ourselves as a planet and a country and as communities. So just to begin, and if you're in this room, then you might already think that we have a problem with how we produce food in this country and with industrial agriculture. But for a lot of people, that just getting to the point where they understand that there might be a crisis or a problem is kind of the first step. And so what I like to do is just kind of begin by pulling out what I think are some of to me, the biggest symptoms of the problem, and start there, not to depress us all too much at the beginning, but just because I think it grounds all of us and why we're even sitting in this room today, why we even care, why this matters. And so first and foremost, I think it's one of let's see how many I have, maybe 4 or 5. So first and foremost, I think especially today, the most important way that our food system is affecting our lives is actually through its impact on climate change and the climate crisis. Have any of you seen The Inconvenient Truth? Some of you? Yes? Or have read about it, or familiarized with it. So, I think nationally, more and more of us are understanding the science behind climate change, understanding the crisis. But I still think there's another step to be taken in terms of understanding actually the role of agriculture in contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and actually being one of the largest contributors to the climate crisis. That connection between food production and climate change, I don't think a lot of people make all the time. And that actually it is industrial agriculture, and particularly factory farming animals, which is one of the world's largest producers of methane emissions from various bodily emissions of those animals that are factory farmed. But it's also that factory farming and industrial agriculture relies, as probably you all know, on enormous amounts of fossil fuels. Not just in the ways you think of with transportation, an enormous amount of transportation to move all this food all around the planet, but also that industrial agriculture is based on using what? Using fossil fuel-based chemicals. That is the fundamental building block of the chemicals and fertilizers that are used in industrial agriculture. And I was reading this study recently by some folks at Rutgers University who were curious to really put a number to the amount of energy that gets used up in transporting our food and having this food system that's so based on, absolutely not local, but so based on transporting food. And they decided to just look at one food item. So they looked at tomatoes. And they did the calculations of how much fossil fuels it takes to bring tomatoes into the state of New Jersey every year. So this is one state, New Jersey, and one item, tomatoes. And what they found is that it used up enough energy that an 18-wheeler could drive to the moon and back 13 times just to get those tomatoes into that state to feed that population. And if you've ever been to New Jersey, you know that there are farms producing tomatoes in New Jersey. If you wanted to eat local tomatoes, you couldn't eat them all year long, but you could get local tomatoes. So the impact of agriculture on the climate crisis is, number one, a huge impact. Number two, industrial agriculture's enormous reliance on water. 70% of all water used in this country is going into industrial agriculture. And it's going into irrigation, it's going into, particularly into irrigation to create the feed that goes to factory farming animals. So water use, that's an enormous environmental impact of industrial agriculture. Third, and related, is not just water use, but water pollution, which in some ways is kind of another form of using water. In other words, if you're polluting water, then that water can no longer be used for a function, right? So the agriculture runoff, for instance, in this country, now, because of the fertilizer that runs off from so much of our farmland, we now have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that swells every year to the size of New Jersey. Not all of my states, for example, tonight won't be New Jersey, but those two were. So we have a dead zone that's being created because of this agricultural runoff, and that's just one of the examples of water being polluted by industrial agriculture. And the fourth symptom to me of the fact that we have a crisis on our hands when it comes to food has to do with the impact of our food system and the choices we've made about what food we're growing and not growing, what food we're producing and not producing on our health. I don't know if any of you heard or saw in the news today, but the state of North Carolina just released a big report about the state of health of kids in North Carolina. And their number one finding was the crisis of childhood obesity in North Carolina. But of course, North Carolina is not alone in that crisis. It's a crisis that's happening all across the country. And so it's the impact of our food system on our diet, what we're eating, everything from foods and additives that we never used to eat before. High fructose corn syrup wasn't even in our food supply in the early 70s, and now you'd be hard-pressed to go into the supermarket and come out without having purchased something with high fructose corn syrup. I was just passing through the airport, obviously, on the way here, and I was looking at some of the options at the airport. It's really hard to find anything without high fructose corn syrup in the airport. Even Starbucks egg salad sandwiches have high fructose corn syrup in them. So all of these added ingredients that we never used to have before. But there's other ways that our food system is affecting our health. I was thinking about it. Just last week, I had to get some antibiotics at the pharmacy. Well, antibiotic resistance and the fears of antibiotic resistance is a huge concern in the public health community of growing antibiotic resistance in the human population. And one of their biggest concerns is that now we are using almost 3/4 of all the antibiotics used in this country are not being used by humans. They're actually being used in factory farms. And in a lot of those cases, it's not just to prevent disease, prevent illness, it's actually to spur growth. So the Union of Concerned Scientists and many other groups have been trying to work with the food industry to try to get them to not use antibiotics. Like a lot of European countries have banned the use of antibiotics in animal farming production systems. So it's health and all of the health-related issues. And it's also in terms of environmental impact of our choices about how we've chosen to grow food and produce food in this country and increasingly around the world. Of course, it's land use and the extent to which so much land is now coming under the use of farming and industrial farming, and much of that is being used to produce the feedstuffs that's then being fed to factory farmed animals. So these are just some of the symptoms of how inefficient and how environmentally destructive the choices we've made about food and farming have been in this country. And what we've been really curious to look at is, well, if these are the ways in which this particular form of food and farming has so affected our environment and our health, well, what would be an alternative? And why, if these are such destructive patterns, why aren't we turning toward those alternatives? And how do we come up with ways to make the way that we produce food and make the foods that we produce actually not harmful to us, but actually giving us life? I mean, you think about it, we human beings evolved eating food that gave us sustenance, right? Eating food that we were able to survive and evolve all these years, thriving on. And we've now are living in this completely paradoxical era where so much of the food that we are producing is actually making us sick. And we have many people dying every year from diet-related illnesses. So it's this complete paradoxical era that we live in now, where we have created a food system that is doing such damage to our environment and making us sick at the same time. And so when we're exploring, well, what are the alternatives? And that's both what we do in Grub and what we do in Hope's Edge. As I think what I realize more and more is that part of what is called upon for us in this era of trying to think about how to make a difference and what path we could take differently, it's about having a mind shift about our relationship to food and agriculture. And it's a mind shift that I'm seeing throughout the U.S. and that we saw all across the world. And fundamentally, it begins with thinking about food and agriculture not as separate from nature, not as just creating factories that can produce certain items that then we consume, and it can all be mechanistic and it's totally disconnected from nature, but thinking about food again as part of nature. And I remember speaking to undergraduates at Eckerd College in Florida, and it was an environmental philosophy class. And I began by asking them, I said, well, when was the last time any of you had inexperience with nature. And it was a small seminar of about a dozen people, and one kid raised his hand. He said, well, I hung out on the beach yesterday. And another kid raised their hand and said, I went canoeing down a river near the college. And another kid raised their hand and said, well, I guess, I hung out on a hammock under some trees. This is Florida college life. This was not my college experience. But so those were the three kids raised their hand, said that, and I said, any of the rest of you, had any recent experiences with nature? And nobody else said anything. And I said, well, did any of you have breakfast? No, of course, everybody raises their hand, right? I said, well, what did you think you were doing when you were eating? What do you think you're doing? And we got into this whole conversation about getting us and we all, this group of us, started talking about, yes, remembering that all food, even the highly processed food that looks very remotely like anything that came out of the ground, but ultimately all food is part of nature. And farms are, and in the best cases, they are tapping nature's wisdom and part of nature. So first of all, what I've been seeing in these movements around the world is remembering that connection between food and how we think about farming and agriculture and the environment and nature, and not making this artificial separation. And the other mind shift is, and these two mind shifts that I'm going to describe have very large, kind of clunky, not so poetic sounding names, but I think they're really important. The first mind shift, and it's happening much faster not outside of the U.S. than here, is this idea of the multifunctionality of farming. Has anybody heard the term multifunctionality? No. Yes, it's not a very pretty term, but it's used in policy by policymakers in the EU a lot right now around food and farming. Anyone want to take a stab at what multifunctionality means? What do you think it might mean? Yeah.
Like the farm not only provides food, but also ecosystem services and water filtration, provides like viewshed or landscape beauty for the neighboring towns.
Right. Exactly. Brilliant. You nailed it. Perfect definition. So the idea that when we think about policy making around food and farming, that farms do a lot more than just produce food, that they are part of ecosystems, that they are also part of the beauty of our countryside, that there's some value to that they also are part of the rural economies. When I go to a lot of rural communities now that have been devastated by the loss of farms, what you find is that you realize that once the farms disappear, all of the auxiliary businesses that were networked into those farms start disappearing as well. The cafes and the supermarkets, the banks and the other institutions that supported those farms. Of course, just like a natural ecosystem, an economic ecosystem is so affected by the impact of small farms disappearing and the buying up of land by large factory farms. So this mind shift of saying to our policymakers, and as policymakers ourselves thinking about how we can bring that mind shift into our policymaking, is a shift that I'm seeing happening in the U.S., but it's much, much further along in the EU and in a lot of other countries. The second mind shift is another, for our ears, maybe not so elegant sounding term, and it's the idea of food sovereignty. So anybody want to take a stab at what they think food sovereignty might mean? Or anybody heard the term before? And if you haven't, you could, knowing maybe what you know about sovereign or what sovereignty means, anybody want to guess what food sovereignty means? Well, what does sovereignty mean? It's control, yeah. When you hear the word sovereignty, what comes to mind? What words comes to mind? Kings. Because why? Why did kings come to mind when you thought of sovereignty? What's that?
They rule.
Mm-hmm. But the idea of sovereignty would be the having if you have your own sovereignty, then having power over yourself, almost having that power of a king, right, over your own community, over your own decisions, your own life. And so here in this country, the term sovereignty, I certainly have not heard it used very much. When I ask people what comes to mind when you think of sovereignty, often nobody says anything because not a whole lot comes to mind. But in my experience in researching in other countries outside of the U.S., the term food sovereignty has a lot more initial meaning for people. And the idea in this mind shift around food sovereignty is the fundamental idea that farmers and consumers should have the power over their own choices about what food they're growing and what food that they are consuming and have access to. And globally, since the mid-90s, there's been an increasingly networked and savvy movement fighting for food sovereignty all around the world. And it's kind of nascent here in the U.S., but it's much stronger in other countries around the world. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Mali, in West Africa, and I was an observer at a forum on food sovereignty that brought together 600 people who were delegates from 98 different countries to have a conversation about what does food sovereignty mean to them in their countries, and how can they, as an international, globalized network of farmers and fisher folk and pastoralists and consumer advocates, band together and fight for policies and fight for and share strategies to promote food sovereignty globally. And so to be there to witness, this was the first time globally anything like this has ever happened. And it was an incredible experience to see all of these people. I mean, most of the people there were rural, like I said, farmers and pastoralists, had never left their own country before. Although many of them were familiar with this global movement, many had never left their own communities. And it was so powerful to hear these people speaking in so many different languages, Korean and Japanese and Portuguese and Spanish and French, and I could go on and on and on, but sharing such similar stories about what they were fighting for and the strategies that they've been employing to try to promote food sovereignty. And one of the common messages across all of these movements all around the world was the fundamental key to food sovereignty for farmers and in some ways kind of analogously for people who are kind of farmers of the sea, the fisher folk, is having the sovereignty over your seeds, right? Because if you can't share and save seeds, if you don't have that power over your own seeds that you're planting to grow your own food, then all of your ability to make choices about farming are completely gone. You can imagine, even though I know none of you are farmers, you can imagine, right, that what you know about farming, right, having access to seeds and power over seeds is a critical piece. And so one of the common messages at this forum was this global concern about the growth of the push by the biotechnology industry to promote genetically modified seeds. And a lot of their concerns, some of them had to do with the concerns about the ecological impact of genetically modified seeds and concerns about the health impacts and that we don't know the long-term impacts on health. But fundamentally, their concern was that this technology requires that every year, if you as a farmer choose to grow genetically modified seeds, that every year as a farmer, you have to buy those seeds again from the company. And that if you are caught saving and sharing any of those seeds, which is fundamentally not just the building block of farming, but fundamentally how farmers have farmed and the cultural base of farming communities globally. If you are caught saving or sharing, or both, those seeds, you will be fined, you will be punished, you'll be sued. And so there I was in rural Mali with 600 people from 98 countries speaking all of these different languages, and yet the one word that I heard again and again and again that needed no translation was the name Monsanto, with all of these farmers from all around the world talking about the impact of this one company. Either a current impact already because some of these countries do have genetically modified foods, or they're concerned about what will happen once they do. Because a lot of the countries that were represented there have moratoriums on the planting of GMOs. And so this idea of food sovereignty and its connection to fundamentally having the right to control your own seeds, the power over your own seeds, was a central part of this mind shift that I think is a critical part of how we're going to create a more sane food system. And the third and the last mind shift is and I think this is especially hard, all of these I think are especially hard for us here in the U.S., but is starting to realize that because food is actually essential to life, that it requires us to have a mind shift about food where we don't treat food as a commodity like any other commodity. I mean, some people might argue that, tennis shoes are essential to life and maybe televisions and all these other things, but we could debate that. But none of us would argue that food is not essential to life. And yet it's treated in the marketplace like any other commodity, and it's sort of left to the whims of the marketplace. And so this idea of shifting from thinking about food as just like everything else to thinking about food as different, and that food and access to food should be a fundamental right of citizenship, is a mind shift that I think is essential to our really getting at the root causes of hunger and getting at the root causes of the food crisis. So what would that look like to have that shift? Well, when I asked myself that question around food as a human right, I was sort of curious to know, well, are there places in the world that have made that mind shift? And if so, what happened? Well, when we started writing Hope's Edge, we discovered that there was a city in Brazil that as a city government in 1993 had this conversation as a city government about the food crisis, about the farming crisis, about all of the impact of the food system on people in that city, and had decided as a city government to declare that their city would make food a basic right of citizenship. And not just any food, not Big Macs and Taco Bell burritos, but good, healthy, organic, sustainably raised food would be a basic right of citizenship. And that if there are people in the city who don't have access to that food because of where they live or how much money they make, that the government had a responsibility to all citizens, not just the wealthy citizens, to give them access to that food. So we thought, this is incredible. We were amazed to hear that this decision had been made by a city government. So we went to the city. The name of the city is Belo Horizonte, which means beautiful horizon in Portuguese. And it's the fourth largest city in Brazil, so I'm not talking about some small town. And we went there about 10 years after they had made this decision. And what we saw is the incredible power of shifting their relationship to food and their relationship as a government to food policy. And what had happened wasn't that the government all of a sudden decided to start spending 20 times as much money on food provisions in the city and open 1,000 new soup kitchens. What they decided was to take the less than 1% of the city budget being used for food programs and use it more wisely. And so they did things like they looked at the junk food, basically, that was being served in city-run schools, in public schools. And instead of just saying, well, that's just the marketplace and it's the cheapest bidder and so that's just what we'll have to accept, they said, well, what if we took our government money and bought locally grown organic produce and had that in the schools? And they did things like they saw that there was all this city-owned land, prime real estate, that was just empty in the middle of the city and in really busy districts. And instead of just letting it sit empty, they actually approached local farmers and they asked those local farmers to come into the city and set up local farm stands. And in exchange, the city government provided buses that on the weekends, those lucky farmers who got that prime real estate for free had to agree to go out into the favelas and into the low-income communities and sell their produce mobily in these markets, these mobile markets, to the people in those communities that were otherwise geographically totally cut off from access to food. They did things like they looked at where there were what economists would call market imperfections, and they tried to redress them. So one of the things, somebody said they were an economics student, one of the things you hear about when you hear about market failures and when the market doesn't work properly is this, the importance of full information. That's one of the terms you learn in economics. And what is full information? It's that in order for a market to work, consumers need full information. Why? Well, because then you know competitive prices, right? And without full information, what happens? You can be price gouged because you don't know you're being price gouged because you don't have full information. Well, what happens in low-income communities that are geographically isolated? They don't have full information. When you go into a lot of low-income communities in this country, you often find that maybe there's a few bodegas, a few corner stores that are providing all of the food for that community. Often there have been studies that have been done that have shown that the prices for the same food sold in middle-class communities, that same food can be twice as much in low-income communities. Why? Well, because consumers don't have full information. So the government of Belo Horizonte saw the same thing happening in Belo Horizonte, but instead of just saying, oh, that's just a market failure, they said, well, what can we as a government do to make the market work better? What if we provided full information? Might that help? So they partnered with a local university and they started publishing every week the lowest prices for 40 basic food items, the 40 most commonly purchased food items, and where you could get those lowest prices. They posted it at bus stops. There's a telephone number you can call. They announced it on the radio. What did that do? How did that change things? It made it so that there was full information. So in fact, that there was competitive pricing. So the government of Belo Horizonte did all of these things, again, not spending huge amounts of more money, but trying to figure out how they can channel the resources that they have as city government in the direction of healthy food for everyone. And a few years later, this was just last year, I reached out to the head of these programs. Her name was Adriana Aranja, and asked her to come to Canada, where we were putting on a Canadian-U.S. conference on food security, on the right to food. And Adriana joined us at that conference, and I had sort of been in touch with her over the years and had heard a little bit about how their work had progressed. But I had no idea how much it had progressed since we were there. So we were there in 2002, and Belo Horizonte had been almost 10 years since they made this decision. Well, since we were there, as many of you know, there was a presidential election, a new president in Brazil, and Lula created a new platform as a president calling for Fome Zero, which in Portuguese is Fome Zero, and it means zero hunger. One of his platforms was to try to eradicate hunger in Brazil. And one of the first steps that he took as president was to go to the policymakers in Belo Horizonte and say, what can you teach us as a country? So when I saw Adriana last year in Canada, she was telling me that she was, after Canada, headed back to Brazil, where she was putting on a conference for 1,100 municipalities in Brazil to talk about how to scale up the programs of Belo Horizonte across the entire country. So the mind shift about food as a human right, it's not just a nice idea, it's happening in countries around the world, and I heard it not just from people like Adriana, but I heard it from the folks that I was meeting with in Mali as well. So these three mind shifts, multifunctionality, they're all bad names, they're not very poetic sounding, but multifunctionality, food sovereignty, food as a human right. That I really believe that in order to have the kind of monumental shift in how we produce food and our relationship to food requires that we have this monumental mental shift as well. And in closing, I would like to just say that one of the things that gives me hope, despite all of the bad statistics that I began with, is that what I have seen across this country, since Grub came out, I've been to about 50 cities. And in every single one of those cities, I've done some kind of community event or community fundraiser. We're doing this one at Seeds on Saturday. And I now feel like I could bet money with any friend of mine that if I opened up a map of this country and pointed with my eyes closed anywhere on that map, and we went there, we would find somebody somewhere in that community doing something that ultimately they might not be calling it multifunctionality of food or food sovereignty or food as a human right, but that it really does represent that mind shift. That we are really seeing a real shift in culture around food in this country. And you can look at any number of indicators to prove your point or prove this idea. You can see it in the number of farmers markets. Do any of you shop at farmers markets? Okay, so I would say maybe half the people raised their hand. So by the 1970s in this country, we had about 400 farmers markets left in the U.S. 400. And those 400 would have eventually disappeared if it hadn't have been for people believing in elements of this mind shift around food and fighting for farmers markets and going to farmers and farmers coming to community members to create farmers markets in this country. And now half of you raised your hands that you shop at farmers markets. Well, now in this country, the number of farmers markets has more than doubled in the past 10 years, and there are more than 4,100 farmers markets now. So just that one indicator. And that wasn't inevitable. It wasn't always this way. And again, if it hadn't have been for direct community action, we would have 0 farmers markets, I think, today. So farmers markets. The whole farm to college movement. So Tavy mentioned that here at Duke, you all are really looking at, and the sustainability department is really looking at how to think about the money that Duke spends on food and how to make that supportive of sustainability. That whole idea of farm to college and farm to university and connecting universities with local farmers, again, has taken off in the last 5 years. And I was just speaking at Yale University that has a really strong program around farm to college. And they were talking about all of these aspects about why farm to college matters, the multifunctionality of it, that it's not just better food for the kids and it doesn't just taste better. They were telling me they launched the farm to college program first in just one cafeteria. And I don't know what it's like at Duke, but at Yale you have to belong. You can only go to one cafeteria that's connected to your residential housing. So you have to show your ID to get into your cafeteria. So they launched this program a few years ago with fresh local food in just one cafeteria because they wanted to start small and they wanted to then scale up. And within the first few weeks that this school and this cafeteria had started serving local foods, my friends at the Yale Sustainable Food Project were telling me they were finding that kids were forging student IDs so they could get into this cafeteria. So the multifunctionality, it's not just better for you, it tastes better. But also, when I interviewed farmers who now sell to Yale, they were telling me, frankly, they said, if Yale hadn't started to buy from us, we were 1 year from going under, 1 year from not being here. So now Yale is not only part of, yes, being able to say, yes, we're providing these local small businesses, these local farmers with a really great market, but they're also part of protecting the landscape or the community and the rural area around Yale and around that city. And I mentioned the taste benefits, but also the health benefits. One of the things that they buy is from a local cooperative of cattlemen who have their own meat processing plant. And the person who I know at the Yale Sustainable Food Project was telling me about visiting the meat processing plant, and he said it was so clean, it was so he felt so confident in the safety of the meat coming out of that plant. And he was telling me that one of the meat inspectors from the federal government had gone into the plant and got on the case of these cattlemen because he said, "Where are your metal detectors?" And these cattlemen said, "Metal detectors? We don't have any and not quite sure why we would need them." And he said, "Well, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but one of the biggest contaminants in meat, and if you look at recalls.gov, you'll discover this. It's really unsettling to think about, but are shards of metal, calculator parts dropping into the meat. So they have metal detectors as the meat goes out to just double check there's no metal in any of the products leaving the meat processing plant. So the health and safety, as my friend Josh at the Yale Sustainable Food Project put it to me once, he said, students shouldn't really be reading The Jungle in English 101 and then eating it for lunch. So Farm to College is an incredible movement. There are now hundreds of colleges. You can go to farmtocollege.org and read all about them. There are hundreds of colleges that are really, really pushing forward this idea of making these connections and thinking about the fact that universities in this country spend $7 billion on food, and what would it mean if even a fraction of that money was going to support local farmers. Farm to School is another incredible movement that, again, was really nascent about 10 years ago, there are now more than 400 school districts in this country that are school districts that are partnering with local farmers. And again, you can go to farmtoschool.org to read all about it. And I think about just locally in New York City, there's an enormous farm-to-school movement. When Grub launched almost exactly a year ago, April 1st last year was my first public launch for Grub, and I was speaking at a farm-to-school conference in New York City, and it was the first beautiful day all year in New York City. So if you've ever lived in New York City, you know that we really, really like our first really nice day. We really are hungering for it. So it was the first really nice day of the year. It was a Saturday. 500 people spent the entire day indoors at a farm-to-school conference in New York City talking about how can we get local food in New York City schools. And we had representation from the school district, from local farmers, and the lunch that was provided for all 500 people was cooked by New York City School District food service chefs, and it was delicious. And to me, the fact that that is happening on that scale, that the New York City School District, one of the biggest in the country, is having that level of a conversation about farm to school is, again, a huge indicator that we're having this mind shift, even if we're not naming it in the ways that I've named it, but that we're having this mind shift all across the country. So when my mother and I were in Belo Horizonte and we're ending our visit there, and I'll close with these last words from Adriana Aranja, the woman who I mentioned, who headed up those programs and is now working nationally in Brazil. When we asked her about her work and we said, what you're doing, this whole concept is food as a human right, it's so cutting edge, it's so out of step really with the rest of the world, but it's so important. When you started this, did you realize what you were taking on, and did you realize how significant this would be? So we asked her this question, and she starts talking, and she's a really passionate woman, and speaking in Portuguese. We're waiting for the translation, and her eyes sort of are tearing up as she's talking. And our translator explains to us that what she'd said is that when she began this work in the city of Belo Horizonte, that she had realized what a crisis that they were in terms of food, in terms of the health crisis in that city. And that she knew what she was up against. But what she had no idea about was that it was so easy to end it. And when she says it's easy to end hunger, she doesn't mean she doesn't work a lot. This woman is one of the hardest working people I have ever met. She doesn't mean it's easy in the sense that it doesn't take hard work. But she means that, and she explained this in her answer, that once you have that mind shift about our relationship to food and our relationship to farming and agriculture, that once you have that shift in your mind, that all of the incredible innovations that we saw in Belo Horizonte and that I'm really sensing are happening across this country, that once you have that mind shift, those innovations become the most natural response. They are easy to come up with. Those creative solutions become essentially at your fingertips. So I'll just end with those words from Adriana and encourage all of you and really all of us to continue kind of trying to open our minds to shift how we think about food and farming for ourselves and really for the whole planet. So thank you so much for coming out tonight.